So I thought I would tell you just a little bit about my educational path, which is somewhat unconventional, but in a way I think that has proven useful to me. Then a little bit about my career path, and then a fair amount about what I'm doing right now, just to give you a sense of how somebody who is in my position spends his time. So Duke is my second faculty position over a 33-year career at this point. Barring anything highly unexpected, I'll finish my career there, which also, as it turns out, is where I started my professional career. Because of the nature of Duke, most of what I do is research, and we can talk a little bit about that idea of a professor being primarily a researcher rather than an instructor. Probably, I would estimate, spend about 2/3 of my time. And by that, I mean probably 50, 55 hours a week working on research. I teach one class each semester, typically a small seminar, nearly always to graduate students, but I just taught an undergraduate seminar that I can tell you about soon. I spend, as do many professors, a fair amount of time on administrative work. I won't bore you with that, just to note that you can't dodge it, and that probably whatever career you find yourself in, that will be part of the deal. So you might be most interested in the education piece. So let me tell you about my particular journey. And then as you're thinking about what you anticipate to be yours, we can have some conversation about that later. And I also can tell you a fair amount about the many students that I advise who have each have their own kind of path. And as you see how they differ, you can begin to see which one kind of fits yours. So I've been around a long time, so I know there aren't a lot of people left with my kind of circumstance. I was in the last graduating class of a small high school in Western North Carolina that consolidated the following year. So there were 88 people in my graduating class. At that point in time, nobody in my family had even earned a high school degree, strangely enough. My brother even dropped out of high school to join the military. My dad didn't finish high school. So I am the prototypic first-gen, or was the prototypic first-generation college student. And for what that's worth, and if any of you in attendance fit that category, almost every university now has in place substantial supports for first-generation college students. Duke has a wonderful full-blown program specifically targeting those people called Robertson Scholars. Just after high school, leaving this very small town, small school, I went to UNC Chapel Hill, a wonderful opportunity. I lasted 6 weeks, and then one evening I just got in the car and left. Found that I couldn't handle being away from home and the size of it. And I just left. So there was a substantial interruption to my college career. And I'll just tell you for what it's worth, although mine is unique, you'd be surprised at how many people have an interruption, either intentional or unexpected, of some sort in their progression through college. And certainly, by the way, COVID has interjected a significant, for some people, disruption to their undergraduate training. So I took a full-time job. 5 years or so later, I became sort of interested in returning to my education. I entered a community college. And the beauty of that was that I didn't know for sure what I wanted to do. And therefore, it didn't make a lot of sense to spend a lot of money and a lot of effort to move somewhere. I earned an associate's degree while working a full-time job. That was another advantage of a community college. That too, that's less and less a common thing, but you'll be surprised at how many people elected to go that route and how little it came to matter down the line that's what I did. After finishing that in 2 years, I went to App State, which at the time was a little bit smaller. It's gained a bit of a national reputation now. If you don't know it, it's in the western part of the state. Quite a few people from this region go there. I elected to major. I'd enjoyed my psychology classes in community college, so I elected to major in initially psychology and sociology. I ended up stopping one class short of a double major for reasons that made sense. And so I finished up there with a psychology degree. I spent a year abroad. So I finished undergraduate with no intention necessarily to continue on. I had an opportunity to spend a year in Africa doing student support work. And during that period, I decided I would go on to graduate school, so that I wanted to be a professor. So after a year away, applied for grad schools from abroad, took the GRE from abroad. I returned back to UNC as a graduate student. At the time, UNC, it was really a matter of luck for me. I wasn't particularly strategic, but it turned out UNC had one of the best social psychology PhD programs in the country. So I spent 4 years completing that degree and earned my PhD at that point. Just for a note, and we can come back to this later, these days, most of my graduate students stay at least 6 years. So the path through graduate school generally is running a fair amount longer than it did. And even when I was coming through, it was becoming more and more unusual to finish in 4 years. So if you add up the years, 4 years undergraduate, 6 years graduate, some cases a postdoc, it's a fairly long process moving toward what's required to get a job that you might choose in the academy as a faculty member. So my first job out of graduate school was a professor at Duke, which was interesting because at that point in time, the field of psychology was going through a bit of a crisis. And in particular, it had to do with what has been a longstanding, and some people would say still, issue within the field of to what degree is psychology a true science? And at this point in history, this would have been in the late 80s, a number of departments had an internal struggle over not whether psychology as a whole is scientific, but whether some parts of psychology are legitimately scientific and other parts are not. And in particular, comparative psychology, that is primarily animal research, cognitive psychology, those were in many people's minds true science. And then other fields like, say, social psychology, many versions of developmental psychology were considered less so. Duke was right in the middle of this battle over what later became known as hard psychology versus soft. And at the time I joined the faculty there, it was in a real problematic place. So at the end of a year there, I decided to go back on the job market, and I left Duke and started what became a 14-year faculty position at University of Kentucky. Now I'll come back around to it, but it's just an interesting bit of history to note that maybe a year and a half after I left, the department at Duke in fact split. And so for more than a decade, Duke had two psychology departments. One that incorporated the so-called hard aspects of the field, and another that constituted the kind of soft sides of the field. So I spent, as I said, 14 years there. That's where I earned tenure. That's where I became a full professor and actually spent a term as chair of that department. After I'd been there 13 years, my wife, who's also a professor, a history professor, received an offer from Campbell University, which is back here. And we saw it as an opportunity to move back to North Carolina, back close to family. So when she received this offer, I contacted a colleague who happened to be chair of the soft side of the soft department and said, you know, I have an opportunity to move. Is there potential for me to have a post back at Duke? To my great benefit, there was. So that's when I returned to Duke as a faculty member, where I've now been for 18 years. So I'm a full professor in what now is a unified single psychology department. In fact, one interesting thing about it is maybe a year after I came back and joined the soft half, the university basically put the two pieces back together, and I was part of the steering committee to reunify the two parts of the department. And that, by the way, is when it became known as the Department of Psychology and Neuroscience, which has now become a pretty common name for what used to just be psychology departments. And we can talk about that in a bit if you would like. So what do I do? How do I spend my time? I have as is fairly common at a place like Duke, I'm the lucky beneficiary of a fair amount of grant support. So I have an NIH, National Institutes of Health Center grant that funds for me a center that is primarily focused on studying the development of skills and self-regulation. I'll say more about that in just a moment, but I employ about 10 full-time people, 4 PhD level people, a couple of master's people, a postdoc, and then people with a bachelor's degree. So that occupies a fair amount of my time. I teach a seminar 1 day a week, typically. So usually I teach it in a format that's 2.5 hours straight with a break in the middle, 1 day a week. And of course, I would have to say I would be misrepresenting my life if I didn't say I spend a heck of a lot of time on email. And then in the midst of all that, a big part of what I try to do is write. In fact, we can come back around to this as well, but interestingly, almost any career, at least in the sort of more research-oriented side of psychology, will involve writing. And it's one of those things that I think many graduate students don't appreciate, that there's a way in which psychological scientists are, as much as anything, writers, that we do research, but that research only gets a life, so to speak, when we write about it. And it's interesting to think about, even these days, when we write about it, what forms do that take? It used to take the form only of journal articles, but now people have lively presences in terms of blogs, and they are very active on platforms like Twitter, for example. So what it means to write and get your ideas out there and get your findings out there has become a much broader thing. Just because I thought it was worth mentioning, I mean, I'm one of those lucky ones who found a version of my career track that lets me do the things I enjoy the most, because faculty positions can involve very many different things. My favorite things are mentoring graduate students. So typically I have 2 to 4 graduate students who come to Duke to work with me. And so they're situated in my research team. And it is my job to get them through on time in a position to get a job when they come out. Another one of my favorite parts is collaborating. If you ever had occasion to look at my curriculum vitae, you would see that every publication is with co-authors. And if you really dug deep, you would learn that most of them, they're co-authors from all over the world. So I very much am, one of my favorite parts of the job is pairing up with other people who have like interests and working together. And then probably last in these favorite things, I would say it's just, I enjoy being in the classroom, but I really like working one-on-one with students. And I have a fair amount of opportunities to do that. 2 undergraduates are working full-time with me this summer on their own projects. So we have twice weekly one-on-one meetings in which we sort of work on their project. I help them think through their priorities and strategies they can use to make sure they get into graduate school when it's time, and the like. So I'll wrap it up, my piece of it, by telling you sort of what I'm working on now. So I told you I spend about 2/3 of my time on research, and you might ask, well, what does that involve? And let me sort of contextualize it by saying my identity within the field of psychology is as a personality and social psychologist. And for reasons we can talk about if you're interested, those two things often come together. That is, people who do social psychology routinely think about personality and vice versa, because these two things, of course, don't operate independently. So within that slice of the field of psychology, here's some of the things that I do. I mentioned to you that I have an interest in, I have a center that is funded by NIH to study the development of self-regulation. By self-regulation, we essentially mean people's ability to control their own behavior in an adaptive way, to set goals for themselves, to pursue those goals in a productive way, and ultimately achieve those goals. And in particular, NIH is interested in circumstances in which people do not develop adequate skills, which often means then they either languish or they get in trouble. They make poor decisions. They don't have particularly well articulated, if any, goals and related motives. So we've had a study going now in the field, a longitudinal study that started with 2,000 14 to 16-year-olds across the state of North Carolina. And we first assessed them at that point. A subset of them, about 400 of them, we went into their homes. We engaged them in a diary study. We took a snip of their hair, we pricked their fingers and got some blood, and we had them spit in a tube, and that allowed us to genotype them, to get measures of particular hormones that turn out to be relevant to development. We've just finished the fourth assessment of them. So some of them are now high school graduates. Many of them are still in high school. And we have a remarkable wealth of data on these people. And that is one source of much of the writing that we're doing is findings we have from this longitudinal 5-year project on adolescence. Second thing I'm working on that has become maybe more relevant than it ever was is the concept of intellectual humility. Some years ago, probably now 8 years ago, the Templeton Foundation put forward a whole lot of money for the purpose of getting scholars to study intellectual humility. Intellectual humility, without going into a long lecture, is just one of the intellectual virtues that philosophers have thought much about for a very, very long time, back to Aristotle. And the interesting thing is philosophers, as brilliant as they are and as good as their work is, they don't collect data. So Templeton was interested in figuring out ways to actually collect data on the intellectual virtues, particularly intellectual humility. And they funded a group that I was part of to develop ways to measure it and then ultimately to study it. For what is, just to give you a very simple definition, intellectual humility is essentially the willingness to consider the possibility that I could be wrong, that I might not know everything there is to know about things. And probably with that definition, you can see immediately why it has become very popular and important at this point in time. There's a serious lack of intellectual humility in many quarters. So part of our work is trying to understand, how do you help people become more humble as it relates to truth and knowledge and understanding. We're doing a fair amount of work, interestingly, right now on intellectual humility and vaccination, not just COVID vaccination, which obviously is very front and center, but generally vaccination. Why is it that some people have certain ideas about vaccines and they're unwilling to consider the possibility that the evidence suggests they could be wrong about it? Third line of work is focused around well-being and resilience. That is, and that too has become a very front and center concept. We just finished last year a 4-year study of college students at 4 colleges studying resilience. The reason we're studying that is the Duke Endowment, another foundation, had heard that more college students are seeking counseling than ever before. So it's a rather remarkable and unsettling trend. And the question is why? Is it that life is just harder in college than it's ever been? There's more stress, there's more pressure. Is it that students are arriving less equipped to handle what they confront when they get there? What exactly is behind it? So the money we received was to try to understand, how it is that students do or do not deal with stresses that are inevitable in the college environment, and all in the sort of spirit of trying to understand resilience. That is, people who are able to stand up to kind of pressure and stress and come out, if not unscathed, potentially even come out stronger as a result. Finally, two last things I'll tell you about. I am, in addition to being a researcher, I write about statistical methods, and I'm revising a book that came out 10 years ago, and is a custom about every 10 years, those get revised. And I have for a while now been collaborating with a colleague at Penn, Angela Duckworth, who is fairly well known for the concept of grit, and has confronted significant pushback about her measurement of grit. And my methodology expertise is in psychometrics. So part of my work is helping with the development of alternative measures to the grit scale. So right now we have a pretty nice version of a measure of determination, we call it. And if you know much about grit, that's sort of what it's about. So that's kind of my spiel, I guess, where I came from, how I got where I am, and sort of what I do now. And I'm happy now to go into a conversation about things you want to talk about.
Great. So let's get started on the question and answer session. If you have any questions, you can just leave it in the chat. So we'll start off first with Dr. Hoyle. What advice do you have for students, high school and undergraduate, who are aiming to pursue majors in neuroscience and psychology?